예, 정말로 쇼바 들려다 잠디 다시 들려스.
So first, we'd like to wish all of you a good morning, or for some of you, just welcome to the teaching.
That tene Tsering chudende jasin muju tome zebe. Tene jazala lendiles.
So the Dharma teaching that we're receiving today is Gyaltse Ngolchu Togme's work called the 37 practices of the 37 Bodhisattva practices.
Yeah. That the maju gondo tene tekwa chembugi da ngaranzo chu indu tene kenamba chama lada and chu nyingi inare chu shigi inare niga gingoni tene 정말 장주 초도 셈기에 개침보레스 대과침보나.
So before we get started with the teaching, since we're practitioners of the great vehicle, it's important to first develop bodhicitta, whether we're listening to the Dharma or explaining the Dharma. As Mahayana practitioners, we must first correct our motivation to that of bodhicitta.
Tulku sugi chu suna ya tene chama la khadu yina tekba chembe gi chu yin songde tene kulong de geche bu indu chu korang la chejung se ma se di chu la da tekba chembo yin kansa tekba chembo yin bar che bala kulong de geche bore kulong de tene tekba chembo yin ji me ji yin gores.
So whoever may be explaining the teaching being given, whether it's a lama or a kempo or a tulku, whoever gives a dharma teaching, whether the dharma is so-called pertains to the so-called great vehicle or the lesser vehicle depends entirely on motivation, and that motivation, of course, is depends on the individual giving the teaching. So it doesn't matter who's giving the teaching or what category the teaching supposedly belongs to. It's the individuals involved who must take up the attitude of the great vehicle.
Kashi ke namba ta tangi tunda tang yure kashi ni ke namba lega ni sulep sa singure tene kashi ni dene tanda shini langba yure ti induzan ngaranzo kulong de ji chu nyamle gomshi yapo ji mena te ngaranzo ge namju du gundu semba khare yoba de dagarang la gomshi yoba ji na te kulong chu ya la tos khapo di indu 당보 야보 대체 솔레 대신에 콜론데 칼레 마치오 고레 이 마이나 단다라 레가닐레 오나 당체 대회에 셈바디 참아 팔레가기 가리 요바디 박차 침보지 샤용도 검시디도 땡 콜롱지 삼로 땅거나 칼레 카고레 다야 야 랑차바당 람사 레가지 삼로 땅거레 남디 균도 나라도 지게 스케줄도 차용도 네, 양 삼로 대한 카가 용도 양 불롱디 심지 탐지기 체도 지금 삼로 다에 또스 갖고 해야 돼. 근데 대체되니 까마치 삼로 다지 되니 우리나라의 최슈에 들에 제춘이에 삼에 고메 가리 지금이나 되게 심지 다 이제 지금 장주선 고방 토백이 체도 이게 지금 센삼야 보지다 오늘 진짜 내라 장고라 샤시 라프디 닝라 샤지니 아나조 지 삼려고 지 땅선나 심지타 제 탈라메 자지 샤미니 심지 탐지 지금만 닝기 닝 탑반 지 뭐니 년바이나 되니 딜라지 간소고레 윤데 삼지 미자버레 지나바요레 rangi semba yang ni ju dosi mashi wa shiba cha ni jangju ke semde ju la ge ge yebu cha du res.
So also for those of us who are listening to the Dharma, some of us may be just beginning our day, some of us may be finishing a work day, some of us may be involved in a practice session or not. We may be listening to this, whether we're listening to this Dharma teaching at the beginning or the end of our workday. If we don't have a strong habit of Dharma practice, then maintaining this motivation of bodhicitta can be very difficult. And so whatever the case may be, whether we need to go to work after this or whether our day is wrapping up, whatever we do at the beginning, especially of a Dharma teaching, we need to take a minute to relax a little bit and think to ourselves, for the sake of all sentient beings, without leaving any aside, I'm going to listen to this Dharma teaching. And if we can really put our hands on our hearts and form this motivation from the core of our being, then even if we don't have a very stable habit of Dharma practice, our restless minds can gain a little bit of peace at the beginning, and then based on this motivation, what comes afterwards will yield tremendous, inconceivable benefits, the qualities of really sincerely from the core of our hearts generating, taking the time to generate the motivation of bodhicitta. This has qualities that defy our imagination.
Ne kulung dedabu kulung sembarja ni sembarja bi chue di tring ne yasin moju thome ge zebi yasila len sodu matires dila ni thomar gewa bardu gewa ani thamar gewa se sum dos.
Okay, so please listen to the teaching with this motivation in mind. And of course, the teaching that we're here to receive today is the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva, which can be divided into 3 parts: the goodness in the beginning, the goodness in the middle, and the goodness at the end.
Ne thomar gewa de song sabare bardu gewa gi shungi den de la tani mondo ge chola chuksu da ngoshi ke busum gi lamla shuksus ni dus.
And so within these 3, we've finished the first one, the goodness at the beginning. So we're now concerned with the goodness in the middle, and this can be further subdivided into the preliminary practice, the main practice. We've finished the preliminary practices, and we're now concerned here with the main part, which refers to the practice of the 3 kinds of beings.
Ni mondo ge chola chuksu de la tani chue dun dus ra.
So there are 7 preliminary practices that must be applied beforehand.
Tani da ngoshi ke busum sum se do lamla chuksu se do ke busum se di tani ke bu chungu ke bu ding ke bu chembos sums.
And then in the main practice, when we speak of the practice of the 3 kinds of beings, this refers to beings of lesser capacity, middling capacity, and great capacity.
Tani da kibu chungu de song sabare kibu ding de song sabare da anda kap sababa kibu chembu gilam de la res.
And we have finished covering the paths of the lesser and middling beings and are now concerned with the path of greater beings.
Tani kibu chembu gilam de la samba jangju chodu sim ke baches di dang ani samba jangju chodu sim ke batela ani kunzo janju ki sem da dondam janju ki sem ni dus.
So the path of greater beings relies entirely on the development of bodhicitta, and within the practice of developing bodhicitta, there are two parts, which correspond to the development of relative bodhicitta and the development of ultimate bodhicitta, these two.
Ini kunzo janju ki sem dela ini nyamsha do dashin jewa gomba da jeto kapsu ini lagle jeto ki chuni dus nyamsha da jeto ni dus kunzo janju ki sem dela.
So within the heading of developing relative bodhicitta, there are two parts. The part which corresponds to formal meditation session, exchanging oneself with others, and then a part that is concerned with post-meditation, and we're now concerned with the second of those, post-meditation.
Teni nyamsha kapsu nyamsha se do jane teni kom jabe kapsu ta ngarang so tun debe kapsu kom meditation ta kom jabe kapsu nyamsha ga de kapsu teni dakshin jeva kombas dakshin jen ra nyamsha kapsu teni de songsa bare jetop se do jane ta tengi kom jab de ni jetop se do jane kom gi tun ni ya lang 참샤 제 공기 튠디 참샤네 제톱스도 ngaramso daily activities ora du 균도 졸람 냐두 사야 조야 라야 다 카리 레가 조야 다 저 값수 세고 졸람 값수 되니 에 값수 되니 쪼바 값수 되니 다 코르와 디나래 데고라야 쇼게 란 고레 레가 도 고레 미투 고레 칼라사 고레 빈자 투 고레 데 값수 되니 지기 율 망보지 게 망보지 지용도 나라서 셈바들라 곰나시 대투고 말해 대도 되니 제도 값 가르쳐 그랬으나 아니 람도 캐바스 람케르기 추주두스.
So when we speak about the section concerned with meditative equipoise, the first section, this refers to our formal meditation session when we're sitting on our cushion and practicing meditating on exchanging ourselves with others. And then what we mean by post-meditation is after we bring our meditation session to a close and get up from our cushion, then there's all sorts of things we have to do, right? We have to go to work, we have to meet with our family, we have to eat food, we have to meet with all sorts of different people, go to sleep, do this, do that. And during these daily activities of ours, we can't just formally rest in meditation, can we? And so what do we do in these everyday situations is we need to bring these daily activities onto the path in some way. And that's what we're concerned with in the section on post-meditation. That's what we mean by post-meditation. And there are 10 points to be considered here.
king ta king amba mangbo the undu zan king in the lam de kep to ba chi changju semba changju ge sim gyule ke chaba ina changju semba ji ina kansa ji ina kani choba kapsu pe ge chim bor nyamsha kapsu ko kom jap de ji mi ko nye za ge yo mare ko lung lang ge chedang lang ge yo mare changpa lang sa yo mare medu te ko shira ka yo mare ta nyum be ta jeto kapsu de ni da men de king ba them bura 근데 네 값을 잔주 semba 탐지기 되네 갱에 람jer sem 되네 원에 진냠래니 개침부 쓰기 레스 네 람jer기 나네 되네 추주 되네 주게 나네 다 드링 타만니들의 착당 람jer세 값 바바레 드링 디데니 당율 람도 켜바세 담보 당율 람도 켜바세 시당 람도 켜바세
And So in the course of our daily activities, the period we call post-meditation, we meet with a variety of difficult circumstances. And so as Bodhisattva practitioners, we need to be able to carry all manner of difficult circumstances onto the path. When we're meditating, it's not so much an issue. We can rest in equanimity. There's nothing there to make us angry or give rise to our attachment, or there's nobody to get mad at, as it were. But during post-meditation, there's all sorts of adverse circumstances we can meet with, things that make us angry, people who make us angry, things we may develop attachment to, and so forth. And so in the context of post-meditation, there are these 10 points concerned with carrying these sorts of negative circumstances onto the path, and we've arrived at the last two, the final two, the first of which is taking anger, or rather taking the objects of our anger onto the path in the context of post-meditation. So these last two that we'll cover is first taking the object of anger onto the path, and then taking object of attachment onto the path. So what comes first is taking the object of our anger onto the path.
Shaloga nishu cheti tsawadi rangi shedang dawlo mathul na chirol dawo tulshin pelwar jurs dechir jamda ingje ma hongi rangju durwa jalse lalin yins.
So the verse we've arrived at in the root text is verse 20, and this reads, "The practice of all the bodhisattvas is to subdue the mind with the forces of loving kindness and compassion. For unless the real adversary, my own anger, is defeated, outer enemies, though I may conquer them, will continue to appear."
Rangi shedang dawo mathul na dawo suduzani dasir. Adila Daudila Nis Shashana, and around the Shedang said the Dao Dase Jura, Dadila Nisha, Chigi Daji, the Nangi Dach, Nis Shahudus, the Ne Tandakaps Baba Shedang Chirug Dasedi. That's all the Tandakaps Baba de share the Nangi Dad Shigir, Nangi Dadi Duxum. Am Tandakaps Baba Shenayang, Shedang Dan Chapani. Chapang Nigi, Wang Dutini, Dase, the Manguji Tungu Rachila. On a genetical diomar. And the Chigi does it do that and Zang around Chig Rangita, Niela, Chapa Game, the Niela Makangi beat into some Dao Chatu. Near the Rang the Tamakanga Suyana did Dao Chatu. The Chigi Dao de la Tene, Ma Yungu Tini, Japa, Mata, Tamenda Duvinias Yungura, then some amount of Chirogi Daos and Tigres.
So this verse speaks of adversaries, and in a Buddhist context, we can understand two different kinds of adversaries or enemies. There are the outer adversaries and the inner adversaries or enemies. And what we're really concerned with here is our inner enemy. And our inner enemy, who's our inner enemy? That's simple. That's the three poisons. Any thoughts that arise based on anger or attachment, especially anger. Ultimately speaking, apart from this, we have no outer enemies. What we call our outer enemies are those people who are the opposite of our friends, the people who oppose or do harm to the people whom we cherish or have attachment to. That's who we call our enemies. And on the basis of these outer enemies, all sorts of harmful deeds may be carried out. Wars are fought and robberies take place, and we cause all sorts of harm to each other on while considering them to be our outer enemies.
Indo rangi shedang drawo matuna shedang drawo situ ta rangi so nangi drati shedang deres. Didi khase matul na tini chirol drati khase tulja ko zogai yo mares binche yo mares. Kare zana so di chirol drati yonga ki kyu so di nangi shedang la tini chirol drati yongu yores. Ta tangbo nangi shedang ki drawo di rangi ma tul tu bayna teni chiro drawo di pele yo maris myungru chage yores kare chir nangi drawo di madul waji teni chiro drawo di tule ge tapla teni ma kya ba ngaju ta ma zoga yemindo kaje mi chen 시제나 zoga che me de gyumje kharasan chiro drawo di ko kirang tering kirang phamala dachi gi mi chi ge na kirang ge pha se sani ko gi mi daji gi chu se ngure ni se tene yang azo ge dad pa sum se shi se na se tene mangro pel joya ma to nyur joya mares dele yaksho de ta kare sersan rang ge yula yobi shedang ta chapara thanda kapso bo shedang de ma tul tu baina se baina tene chiro dawo de ya tene gyunche tu res tene to deras rang ge shedang dawo ma tul na kase ma tul na chiro dawo tul je Kasetul naya tul tungu mares peldu gures mangro mangro gures.
So particularly in this context, our primary inner enemy is our own anger, as it reads. Unless the real adversary, my own anger, is defeated, outer enemies, though I may conquer them, will continue to appear. As for so long as we have not conquered the inner enemy of our anger, then there's no end to the outer enemies that we will encounter. If we are able to subdue our own anger, then it's a different story. If we can subdue the inner enemy of our own anger, then our outer enemies will not increase. We'll have fewer and fewer so-called outer enemies. And in the opposite case, if we don't defeat the inner enemy of our own anger, but instead try to conquer our outer enemies, then there's no end to this. As we can see, there's people fight wars all the time against their outer enemies, and this has continued unabated forever, and it doesn't go away, it doesn't get less, it grows more and more. Some group of people kill some other group of people, and then in revenge they try and kill them back, and on and on and on. And things like war just increase without end on the basis of considering others to be our outer enemy. And this is all a function of not having conquered the inner enemy of our own anger. If we can subdue our own anger, then we will cease to perceive outer enemies.
예, 베나 멜라레바 다부레스 멜라레바 데니 코랑게 당보 아마 기 칼레 녜체니 데니 치로기 코랑게 아고 아니디다 코랑게 다샤데 데니 아고 아니니디 다디마 메바스에 차실라디니 아마기 코랑 멜라레발라 투장가 땅지 마 롱발레 용네 데니 멜라레바기다 짬메 땅 곳은 롱바 상마 메바스 데니 미망보지 시 다시소나야 다동 그 다우덴조 다로 카실하데 다 미망보지 가 응라 아고다 아니니르 다 시주 멜라르바 다 망보시 요차레 가르서 거나 튀땅도 롱바 상마 짬메 땅도 롱바 미 상마 마가와 차앙도 데니 미 상마 멜라르바레 슈르지 슈르니 다고 율피에 타시 땅 세기 인라는데 멜라르바 트레도 두라 트레트레트레치는데 타마 오리줄레 데치는데 다초 민두 말라 담몽보사 다드니 조가야민다 아마야드니 도바 마침 가르사 아마 더름 기부 메레 Lumba meva suenaya avmakibu machung tini melaraba joba che tini rela page tini mel marba tu che che yondu tama korange sim nangi daudi shedang di ma dulcha yondu tini kong ta dulegi yuzo de jamba da ningji yondu tini kongi gyude semba de dul yondu ani kongi chiro mi sama de kongi da tongo yoma ningji gi yul tongo jambi gi yul tongo Tende chinedeni jella kongla dra mewa char ta kana sam dra so de nang shetang de du shetang ge dawo de ma tulyong du de endo jangju semba de zo thangbo nyamlen chiyo go so thangbo rangju madul na shengju dule khapore de endo rang gyu de thangbo shetang de ma dul chine tene ni shengju dul shengi sen dule ge tene chiga khaso go thapla chun de che de jangju semba ge ne nyamle res.
It's we can think about the story of Milarepa. It's like the story of Milarepa. Milarepa, on the advice of his mother, his aunt and uncle became their enemies, but it didn't suffice for him and his mother to just to kill his uncle and auntie, and that wasn't enough. They had to go on to use dark sorcery to wipe out the entire village where their uncle and auntie lived. And then even after massacring this entire valley full of people, even that wasn't enough to satisfy the rage that Milarepa's mother felt. And Milarepa, recognizing this, understanding that he didn't just slay his own enemy, his uncle and aunt, but massacred this entire community of people. He later felt remorse for this and sought out the teachings of Marpa and practiced them. And as we know, he subdued the inner enemy of his own anger. And having done this, he ceased to perceive anyone outside of himself as an enemy. It became, even though he had massacred entire villages, it became as if he had no enemies, because he didn't see anyone as an enemy anymore. He saw everyone as an object of compassion. And so, like this, as Bodhisattva practitioners, the first step in our path is to tame our own minds. Because if we don't first tame our own minds, then taming the minds of others is very difficult, or close to impossible. So the first step is to tame our own minds, that we may be able to benefit beings. And what do we mean when we say tame our own minds? This refers to practicing Dharma.
Dela page years, pedi countries and a pena Kiranzo Rigla Pegoena, Ridila hiking the Dogoena, then read it Sama Serma Sagoa, throne. The net Serma Gang deres, the Ridi Kiranji Miji hiking Dogoere, the Ridi Sama la throne Serma Gang deundu. The Kiran read the Sama Serma de Meva Sogo Kazis Suena, telling Azu Sue to beg Kalikapore, Karsana, Yurbu Togura, and Mrs. Richambura. The Kiran la Tapsi Chigers, Karia words, and Kirangi Kamba de la Hamgo, Uage Hamgo doa, protect the throne, protect the day Yabo, Hamgo Yabo, things on America, secure, the Kawak secure, and the Uage Hamgo, the Kirangi read the Pura Uage Kak, which is not too much, and Mrs. Yurbu Togres. Kiran Kamba la Hamgo Yabo, Jiquensona. The combat Jabrona throne Sugumara, the Indozani, Chigi Dao throne the Meva Sue or Chena, Kalikabors, the Rangi Nangi Daos and Rangi Kamba, the Lambo, Kuayapojitum Shana, combat Jadrona, the Nitserma Sugumares, the Deshindu, Chiro Dao, the Kazi Patulna, Tultukumar, Mana Peldures, the Indo Rangi Nangi Dao, the Tultuna, the Chiro Daoyama Tultugures.
So an example for that, we can think of this with the following example. Imagine there's a mountain that you have to hike, a huge mountain, and you absolutely have to hike across it, but it's absolutely covered in thorns everywhere along the mountain. It's covered in nothing but thorns, and if you have to hike across this mountain, then you might first try to get rid of the thorns, but that's totally futile. No matter how many thorns you attempt to get rid of, there's still more, and they just grow back, and there's no end to exterminating the thorns from this mountain. And in the process of doing so, you're definitely going to get pierced or cut by these thorns. A much better idea is to just make yourself some strong shoes, like the protective hiking shoes, like the kind they make in America or other places. And so if you wear these strong protective shoes, then it doesn't matter how many thorns there are, you can walk across the mountain with ease without getting pierced by these thorns. On the other hand, no matter how much you try to clear the thorns away from this mountain, all that's going to happen is that you're going to end up being pierced by the thorns and they're going to grow back. But if you just wear some sturdy, heavy duty shoes, then you can just walk right across the thorns and not be pierced by them. And so this is the metaphor we use for taming the inner enemy of anger. That's like wearing the shoes as opposed to trying to tame the outer enemies, which is like attempting to get rid of all these thorns.
Ni chigi ri ki charma di chirog dawusha. Ni di tulo jabala duzu togre. Ta duzu yoksho di dule di tab yaksho di nangi dawudi rangi kambala hamgo kweni nangi dawudi dulto na tani chiro dawudi kaya ne tugu mares. Di labres pit.
So again, in this example, the thorns on this mountain are like our outer enemies, and in order to conquer our outer enemies, that would just take an enormous amount of time. But the best method for supposedly conquering even our outer enemies is to conquer the inner enemy of our anger, and then it doesn't matter how many outer enemies we have, we won't be pierced by these thorns, as it were.
Ne ta tene nangi shedangi daude sui dulgiresena suki dulgiresena tene ta nangi daujera shedangi daude sui dulgiresena tene tsikjidwa dela dechir nangi shedangi daude sui dulgiresena jamda inje ma pongi is del labda dechir jamda inje ma pongi rangju dulba jasa lagle is ta de dulgengi zo di sui dulguresna jamna ningji ni dulgures ta chirogi nangi shedang da daujera daji o de dulge zo di ta jamda ningji ni gone dulgures shibata merda.
So who is it that conquers this inner enemy of our anger? Who is it that overcomes or subdues this enemy? It's, as the verse reads, it's primarily with the forces of loving kindness and compassion. The practice of all the bodhisattvas is to subdue the mind with the forces of loving kindness and compassion. And so it's these two things, through loving kindness and compassion, we're able to conquer the inner enemy of our own anger. In fact, there's no other way to do that than through these two.
Jamba na ningje ki jamba ke shedan ke dawutul wadang ani ningje ke shedan ke dawud tul ki res de indozani de rangju dulwas ta rangju dulwas to rangi simdi rangi simjira tangi shedang jido nangi odi dulgu res jamba da ningji nig.
So loving kindness can conquer the enemy of our anger, and compassion will also serve the purpose of subduing our inner enemy, which is our own anger. It's through these two forces, because this true enemy is inside of us, right? So it's through these inner forces that we must subdue this enemy.
Jamba da ningji nigi rangi sim nangi the shedangi dao di tulni tini nangi dao nyomba nangi dao sena da nyomba da shedang di any member swing nyungru tang tini nyungru kale tang ni tini bed khora member swing tini changju semba namji dendi chin nyamlin chigi res gi da del.
So with the forces of loving kindness and compassion, we subdue the inner enemy of our afflictive emotions, primarily our anger, but really this applies to all the afflictive emotions. And we start gradually by practicing loving kindness and compassion to slowly reduce the force of our afflictive emotions. And then gradually, as our afflictive emotions grow weaker and weaker and weaker, we are able to get rid of them entirely, clear them away entirely through the forces of loving kindness and compassion. And this is how all bodhisattvas are intended to practice.
이제 미망보기 대화 망보다보다 shedan chebo 미망 제발래 shedan 축전보 용도 전에 shedan게 다 님보 가르템 그래 가르템 벌스 미망보 지기도 다 shedan게 님보디 약쇼디 탑 약쇼디 되니 잠바다 닝지니레스.
So people ask all the time, all kinds of people, practitioners and non-practitioners, all kinds of people always say, it's like, oh, I feel such great anger. I have a lot of anger. So what do I do about this? How do I deal with this anger? What is the antidote to this anger? This question comes up all the time. And the answer is really quite simple. It's that the antidote to anger is loving kindness and compassion. So when we use the term enemy or adversary, this refers to the object of our anger.
ni shedange daudi dadita kirang samne botang gore dela takshi je gores dadi chironi yungutu ki dadi nangni yungutu dadi takshi je gores kirang.
But so then what we really have to do is investigate, ask ourselves the question, does this anger that we feel, does it come into us from outside, or does it come from within us? Do we experience it inside of ourselves? We have to figure this out.
지단게 미망 저와디 다세 디칠로네 용도 챙겨다 실로 미지는 가시다 랑송 가시다 첨부 차송 저랑게 지는 가시다 첨부 차송 저랑게 지는 가디 차송 몸불라게 러스.
So most people will say it's like, oh, it comes from outside. That guy made me angry. Or you made me angry. This made me angry. That made me angry. The blame falls on the object of anger that lies outside of me.
다우 세나레 등객 세나레 상아조게 등상게 동데스 고스 거래 스피릿 거래 된저 창마디 용서 인생이 출난들라 때니 연구레스.
And so we call these objects of anger our enemies, or sometimes we speak of obstructing forces, or they're even depicted as ghosts or external spirits, but really all of these are simply the deluded experiences that arise through duality.
Tene narang mangjogi hamakunge jina chu dawu se di das se di jaji gyan jaji gubju gonga jaji gya peche chilo res tinge res shedan bi yul dawu di chilo ni chige re tinge res
So if we leave this unexamined, then most people won't even think twice about it. 110%, oh, the anger comes from outside. It comes from the object of the anger. It's not my fault. Something makes me angry. This is what people will say if we don't really investigate the issue.
Gaja gubju göngan peche haku gure di dawo di dati chungsa tso di rang mizing de la tene deni shedang di korang da deni pa jatong de ma do shedang la tene jatong de ma do chiro la daji chamar dubyo mares ta ina ya gaji nga se choose chi ken la tene chiro de tunang yul la tene deni nazo le ken chi ne tene nangi shedang ngoma dawdi rangi nangni ma tene pa reflect chini pajo la gaja gyatama soisha res muni chini gaja gyat chilo no mare nangi genchi rangi project chi yondo shedang digi tene gyatama chilo soisha res.
Or if we do investigate, if we study the Dharma and investigate a little bit, we may say that some percentage, maybe like 80 or 95% of the times I get angry, the anger comes from inside of me as a projection of confused dualistic experience. But some percentage, maybe 15% or less, some percentage still comes from external conditions. On the basis of external conditions, anger arises within me. But really, as Bodhisattva practitioners, we have to understand that 100% of our anger comes from within us as the result of deluded dualistic experience.
Chigi peche chilo le gaje nga amyana chugi kengi chine chilo ge midigi kengi chine tene ngarangzu nangi tulnang digi gaje gupju go nga rangi shedang ge reflection ge chine gaje jatamba chilo ne ligi re tingi re sanarzu mi palba jina.
Okay, so sorry, I got that wrong. So maybe in an incidence of anger, maybe 5% of the blame falls on the external object, which, so on the basis of the external object, 95% of the anger comes from within us and is then reflected or projected onto the external objects. So it's maybe 5% the outer object and 95% our own internal anger.
Dingi chine domne deni ngazogi gaja gyap changma chilo ne legi yore tingi yores.
Yeah, going back younger someone
gaja nga kengi chine deni gaja kubju ko nga rangi ta shedang tunangi chide. Da ina di ni kengi chini gaja nga dila nga zo ge project chi ondo gaja gas so shake res chilo ne le re tinge res.
Okay, so we can say that anger arises 5% due to our meeting with some sort of adverse external condition, but 95% of it is just the projection of our confused experience. But 100% of the experience of anger occurs in this meeting of the 95% that is just within us, and then the just little bit of external condition accounts for all of the anger that we feel.
That's that Dini Ranju Dulva Jasala Lens, Ranju Dul Siduzani, Tening is Shumba Jamba than Yingji Gone, Dini Nyomomba, Dini Shedang, the Meber Su, the Jasanam Gilale Res, Jamba than Yingji.
So then the solution to this is as it reads, the practice of all the bodhisattvas is to subdue the mind with the forces of loving kindness and compassion. So this is really the answer to this experience of anger that we deal with. The solution is to rely on loving kindness and compassion.
Let's the Shedang Lam the Kirwas, the Nibadi Chayu Lam the Kirwas, the Shedang. You lam the kirwas and the and that the chagu lam the kirwas.
So that verse covered the practice of taking the objects of our anger onto the path, and the verse that follows is concerned with taking the objects of our attachment onto the path.
That's all the Chatani Gichine, the Maranzo Kanso Sem de la Kipu Mayong Wata, Sembajila, Ranjola, Chapata, Shenjola, Danwa said this. Chakdani Gichin, Maranzo Sembadele Shide Mayong. So you did Chakdani Gichin Virus.
So generally, it's said that the reason we don't experience peace in our mind, the reason that our minds are so restless and agitated all the time is because we experience attachment to things we perceive as me and mine, our own side, feel attachment to our own side, and aversion or anger to our other side, to what is considered external to us or our enemies. So based on this attachment and aversion that we feel, our minds get no chance to experience peace.
The Zawadi, Chayu Lam the Kirwa Zawadi, Debi Yunde, Lenzi Chudandras, Jizam Jajan, Sepapel Warju, Gangla, Shenja Kebi, Mobo Nam, Tala Pongwa Jasala, yes, the Dunzen Nishutajik Redus, Sholoka.
So then the 21st verse that concerns taking the objects of our attachment onto the path reads, the practice of all the bodhisattvas is to turn away immediately from those things which bring desire and attachment, for the pleasures of the senses are just like salty water. The more we taste of them, the more our thirst increases. So this is specifically dealing with sensory pleasures that we may be attached to.
Then ye comes Shedangi comes Baba, Shedangi Yuldi Drashi, Tanda comes Baba, Chayu Lam the Kerwas, Chakpagi Yul Lam Keres, the Chakpagi Yul the Karesana, Naranzola, Doyonga, Sugda, Di Ro Reja, Didi Chakpagi Yulres.
So whereas the previous verse was concerned with the objects of our anger, namely our enemies, this verse is concerned with the objects of our attachment, which refers primarily to desirable objects of the five senses, the sense pleasures, pleasurable sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and sensations. These are objects of attachment.
That Doyonga said, the doing Debi in the situation, doing a subta tiru lecture tilla, the Tang around Korba Moni Chidang Jigdin, Dinang Lola, Tang around the Pichevata, me Mangchevati, doing Yudela Tini, Cham, Zimba, Shenja, Chibu, Chan, me Chigi Mobochiku, Langazo Yarke Tangaya. That the Naranzo Chick scientists in a Lord Yargishata Tang de Gioria, Chigita, Mobochiku Yargeta, Mobosana Kara, Sub, Ja, Giro, Rexata, Tenzore. Tenzo Yargi, Jabo, Tang Sona, Naranzola, Chisogan, Lola, Tini, shide kipu jengure chene ni di chibu ji yarge tang de yores tensang.
So these days, ordinary people in the world are so attached to the pleasures of the senses, to desirable sense objects. We experience lots of desire and attachment and clinging and grasping to the desirable experiences of our senses. Like if there's something that people like, we immediately try to make more and more and more and more and more of that, whether it's something developed by scientists or what have you. If there's a thing that people like, what we mean by that is something that pleases our senses, some sight or sound or taste or smell or sensation that is pleasant to us. We try to increase this as much as we can, make more and more and more and more and more of them. That's just the way it is these days.
Pena chisok se tu zan ta ngara zo chige politician ina nangle na re business ki nanglo ina re ini nangmi ki nanglo ina re ta khari ki section khawa chole ina ya chi ki ngobo ta yarge ta di zoe yo mares khari jin zoe meres na tangi wa ya gang la do denga la ngara zo chakba di zimba di zoe gyun yo mares chik sui ta pena phone daoji na iPhone daoji na tanda sa khare chuni chuksun chupshi lep chadus ti tangbo chik ni sumshi dini yarge mangro tangjini chakba zimba cheru droe ma do nyungru droe yo mares chingobol.
So whether we're a politician or a businessman, or even just within the context of a single family, we're always engaged in trying to increase and produce more of the objects of our desires. There's no end to it. Take an iPhone, for example. It started with an iPhone, and there was an iPhone 2 and an iPhone 3, and now we're on iPhone 14 or 15 or 16. I don't really even know. It's not getting less. It's not going down. We're constantly increasing and producing more of the things that we supposedly like. And the reason for this is because our clinging and our attachment to these things that we like isn't reduced by itself. It just grows and grows and grows.
Didi conditioning better with Shana de la Lado, the Lenzi Chudambras, Lenzi Chusina, Maranzo Chachus, Salt, salt gig chuji tumbaina, Ka Mangro Marukum, Kaze Tumbaina, the Gazaga Kakum Gris. That the big is so that Diro Regala, the need long Kaze Chencha Mang Shukchumbuji Kesona did Lenzi Chudabres, Kaze Lamna Dilla ko Shenja Nyuru Dry Yomaris, Mano Dry Mato, Kanas the Lenzi Chudabres, the Subta Diro Gitoyangat. And Dilla ko Kakom, the Nichu Maro Tungi Duguramato, Chutungi Mandro and the Chagi Mares. Shenja Cheru Dry Gichibugi, Yu Chapuveres.
So the example that's given for this in our text is, it reads that the pleasures of the senses are just like salty water. The more we taste of them, the more our thirst increases. And so if we have water that's very salty and we're thirsty, if we drink the salty water, our mouths just get drier and drier, or we grow thirstier and thirstier. The water doesn't quench our thirst. It just makes it worse and worse the more we drink of it. And this is what desirable objects of the senses are likened to in this text, is like a salty water that doesn't quench our thirsts, but we keep drinking it in hopes that it will, but all it does is make us thirstier and thirstier for more.
Kaze de la longche ba ina sukta de regala Tene digi shenja sibas ne shenba chakpa di pel duguru maro nyung dugu mares pena lense chu tumba tabures.
And so likewise for the desirable objects of our senses, the more we indulge of them, the more our desire and clinging to them grows. It's not the case that we indulge in this sense pleasures and our attachment to them decreases. It just grows and grows and grows, just like drinking salty water. There's no salt in it.
Gang la shenja me be ngobo nam jizam jejen sepe pelwarte gang la shenja ke be ngobo nam thala pongwas gazalane se gang la shenja ke be gi ngobo ta shenja kesa ge ngobo sidu tani doyenga la sige suk da di rekja la lak stubati yomar ta chi ngobo se mi gi suk thoya da na ju ge da thwe da di 나기 디초라야다 로 제게 로 용아야다 숙다 렉자스나 나라서 숙불라 류라 드니 잠보 쭈뿌 드니 덴데기 류라 덴데기 싱아게 되용아 가레지 현자께 바이나 딩오보 삼절라 다 약쇼디 가레지 버스나 다들 뇽으로 땅에 단지 렌즈 추다고 마임바치니 the nyungru tang ge thab yakshu de karesna ta sukta dudu rekja le pha yang rings trobos yana sukta dudu rekja ma pangos.
So to read the verse again, the practice of all the bodhisattvas is to turn away immediately from those things which bring desire and attachment, for the pleasures of the senses are just like salty water. The more we taste of them, the more our thirst increases. And so when we speak about things that bring desire and attachment, thing in this case is just anything that can be perceived by our senses, something that we can see with our eyes or hear with our ears, taste with our tongue, smell with our noses, or sense something that we can feel with our body, something that produces a gentle or a rough sensation. These are what we refer to as things that we may develop desire or attachment towards. And what is the best antidote to this desire and attachment that only grows and grows the more we indulge in the sense pleasures? It's to turn away from them immediately, to cast them, to leave them far behind, remove yourself, keep yourself at a distance from these things that you develop a sensory attachment towards.
Di tanda thala pong se do zane kareji kandeji ni pong goresana tene duk nangsing poison nangsing tene kare resana di shempa di chakpa di ngarang zola semba shiba sugi mare shiba sembo pi sugi mare ani digi chakpa digi ngarang zola kanso gore sembo kuyangbo sugi mares di endo zani di paponge gi condition pangorosna do nangsing ko ta nyomo ba do gram roya chakpa di endo zani do nangsing chine pa pongores de sepa de chakpa sne sepa sipa se da sepa o di ta pangores.
So how is it that we should turn away or leave behind these things that we develop desire and attachment towards? We should turn away from them as if they were poison, because it said that we should consider them as if they were poison and leave them far behind in that way, because it's not the case that these things bring us satisfaction. And so like a poison or salty water, which we know that would harm us if we were to consume it, this is how we should consider those sensory things that we have attachment towards.
Tadi pangdang yang takje yakbo je tangsuna sukta diro rekja ki chigi dön digi ngazola chakpa pele gi gyu chigi do yana nang zimbi gi semba sem digi chiro ngobu ma pele gi gyu chigi do dingi yang takje tang.
And so in order to turn away from them, we should examine, is it the case that sorry, I didn't quite understand. Damkani karakarare.
Chigi dönga sej doa sukda diro yach namgi chakpa ji doa sipa dingi la takje tangore namgi chakpa ya pelegi gyudi dönga redam yana dönga digi namgi sim chakpa digi dönga ya pelegi gyuri dingi gyu khandiri takje tangore.
I just muted myself. So we need to look at this closely again and consider what is it that causes our desire and attachment to increase? What is it that causes our minds to constrict and become restless around these objects of our attachment? Is it the objects of the senses themselves, or is it our own inner attachment towards them?
다 미카시기스나 되다 나랑도 직당기 되응아디 시기 오보디 대조 창마 나랑도 직된데 나랑로 초와 종아에게 제도 비 개첨부레 징겨 디지도 간서 야르게 땅 되게 다 야르게 가즈 땅 나야 친구보 야르게 가즈 도나야 아주 셈바들라 대와 메레 대와 요 말에 시바 요 말에스 디 인도산이 칭오부기 나졸라 셈발라 다 나랑서 단다 된데다 온도자니 칭오부기 나랑서 셈발라 컨트롤 지교다 보지 착바 펠드웨 규디 오부다 오지 요 이나 오네 지나 칭오부 펠레기 셈바 착바디 펠레디 규디 오부 말에 실로 규 오부 펠레기 규조디 착바디 지 착바 조게 메도 되니 칭오부 조게 메레스 야르게 땅 되기도 저 유조의 착바들에서 착바들 뭐 쳐고래 뭐 시에고래.
So most people would say, of course, it's the objects themselves that cause our attachment to increase, and it's important that we produce more and more of them for the sake of society. That's the way the world works, as we need to have more and more of these things that we have desire for and improve the things that we already have. And as such, there's no end to the production of things in the hopes that they will satisfy our senses, but they don't actually bring our minds happiness, do they? This endless production of this and that doesn't bring our minds happiness, and it doesn't bring our minds peace. Rather, it's just increases our attachment, and because our attachment knows no bounds and knows no end, likewise the production of these things intended to entice our sensory attachment also knows no end.
디도 다 딜라 장주셈바 가시기드니 찰 뽕와 자슬랑렌스도 단다 네갑라드니 나랑조 파디 치모부 되응알라 드니 지 착바세고레 되응알라 파빵 찰 단다 찰스나 단다라 빵 드니 뇨몽바 디 착바디 뇽르 chakpa zimba jora nyuru chakjuwe de dine chanju semba ge laglen res nyamne res ngarang zo na long je ge ra chanju semba de zo na chal pangge ta jang rings to ge res ta dinde pang ne dine chakpa nyuru su ge res chakpa nyuru to na ngarang zo ge semba de la shiva de dewa yubura ani jen simje la pento ge re rang je bo je ma to ngaja phe du ge res chakpa shu che ro chana sama nga go nga sa ge nga chi bu nga de gen mo bo la pa thul ni ni chi ngo bo ji bu la sam no tan de ge res nang shi de len ha bo top gu ma res nang gi sim
And so we ordinary people hanker after these objects of this senses. We take them up readily, but a bodhisattva, their practice is to turn away from them immediately. That's what the verse reads, is to turn away immediately, right then and there. And the purpose of this is that it reduces our attachment. And the more we can reduce our desire and attachment, the more peace and happiness we will experience inwardly in our minds. The more desire and attachment that we have, the more we indulge in these sensory delights, if you will. That just causes our pride to increase. And because we think, oh, this is mine, but I need more. Now this is mine too. And I need this and I need that. And me, I need this and this and this and this. And acting in this way doesn't bring our minds any peace. But reducing our attachment, which is the root of this sort of thing, will bring our minds peace and happiness.
kunzu janju ge sem de peje charwares kunzu janju sem de la de ni nyamsha gapsu nyamje dakshin je ba go me na je to gapsu de ni chuchu de la de ni lamjir ki chuchu do de tring chabares.
So with this verse today, we've reached the end of this section on developing relative bodhicitta. If you recall, there was the section on meditative equipoise, which concerned the exchange of oneself with others, and then the practices of post-meditations that involves bringing adverse circumstances onto the path. These 10 points that we practice to bring our daily activities onto the path. And with these two verses, we've concluded those 10 points, and as such, reached the end of the section on developing relative bodhicitta.
Jeto gwabsu tanda di chu dewa namba chu sigere. Di gome gyumzen kariresana ngaranzo jeto gwabsu di kapsu mi shemba gi nyoba chibadang. Ani mi shemba gi ngaranzo la mi shemba gi cheni ngaranzo nyomongba chi mangdo pel dowa tabudang. Ani di induzani teni jeto kapsu chu di soba gomba am lamdo ke tube kaze dende ji chituba ina teni rangi di che ki zo di temba shishin payu ta jamba ingje denzu la teni sim big wangdo mandwe jeto kapsu temba shishin payu jamba ingje denzu gi teni ji jeto kapsu di kashi jigi tabla teni ngaranzo ge jigi semba di shemba noba wangdu mandwe jeto kapsu de negi nyamnen che redus zodi.
So in the context of post-meditation, we have these 10 virtuous practices for bringing things onto the path. What is the point of these practices? The point is that during post-meditation, we'll encounter things we don't like, we'll encounter people and situations that harm us, that cause us harm. And so the point of these practices is to not fall under the sway of these harmful circumstances, but instead to rely on the methods of mindfulness and watchfulness and conscientiousness, as well as loving kindness and compassion. If we can rely on these methods in our post-meditation and our daily activities, then we'll be able to not fall under the sway of the negative circumstances that we are bound to encounter.
Chakpa dangwa ni pel rura de mandro ge tabla deni jamba shishin bayu deni tanda jamba ingje dichiyona deni tanda jeto gapso ya deni denzola ya kompel tae pel dwe deni nyoma bu wangdo mandro ge deni tabam deni ji gewa deni chu da woji ring chaba res chedang ge nyamne chedang.
So that's really the main point, is to not fall under the sway of these harmful circumstances, because if we fall under the sway of harmful circumstances, then our attachment and aversion will increase. And so instead, to continue to work to reduce our attachment and aversion in post-meditation, we rely on mindfulness and watchfulness, conscientiousness, loving kindness and compassion. And if we're able to rely on these qualities to keep us from falling under the sway of negative circumstances, then our afflictions will not increase, but these qualities themselves will increase. And so that's the main point of these practices. And with this, we come to the end of the section of the text that deals with post-meditation. And so that means that today we've also completed the section on developing relative bodhicitta, and we'll leave it there for today. So next week we'll start with the development of ultimate bodhicitta and proceed from there. So if there are any questions, you can post them in the chat like before, if you have questions. All right, well, then we'll leave it there for today. So now the virtue that you've all developed through listening to the Dharma, as well as the virtue that we may have developed by attempting to teach it through the virtue that arises from the meeting of these two circumstances, we will now dedicate that virtue. So